The day broke gray, the kind of gray that muffles sound and lays a heavy hand on the shoulders of the living. Clouds sagged low over the church steeple, and the narrow street outside was lined with cars, their windows glinting faintly like dull mirrors. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and candle wax, and every footstep seemed to echo with more weight than it should. The funeral procession had already begun its slow march. At the front, a black hearse glided forward with the restraint of ritual, carrying within it a casket draped in the nation's flag. Behind it came the family, their eyes hollow with grief, their steps uneven as they tried to keep pace with duty while dragging sorrow behind them. Behind them walked a group of soldiers in dress uniforms, their boots striking the pavement in rhythm, their faces composed into masks of solemnity. They carried themselves with the practiced dignity of men who had been told 100 times how to bury a comrade, yet still felt each burial as though it were the first. Civilians lined the sidewalks, some with hands over their hearts, others with bowed heads. A few clutched flowers, waiting for the moment to release them onto the casket. The street, usually busy with morning traffic and chatter, had gone quiet. It was as though the city itself had stopped breathing, letting the funeral pass through it like a wound that demanded respect. And then, as the procession turned onto the long avenue that led toward the cemetery gates, he appeared. The tomb guard had not been on the program, had not been listed among the pallbearers or escorts. He was not there as part of any order or assignment. He came from the crowd. One moment, he was simply a man in plain clothes, standing with the civilians, his posture too straight, his gaze too steady. The next, he stepped down from the curb and into the street, falling into line beside the soldiers as if he had belonged there all along. At first, there was confusion. A murmur rose among the onlookers. Some wondered if he was out of place, if he meant to disrupt the solemnity. The soldiers walking in formation noticed him instantly. Their eyes flicked sideways, a silent question passing between them. "Who is this?" But they did not speak. Something in his bearing silenced doubt. He matched their pace effortlessly, his stride neither hurried nor hesitant. His back was straight, his arms steady at his sides. Though he wore no uniform, he carried himself with the unmistakable precision of one who had lived within its rules. Those who recognized him felt their throats tighten. He was one of the guards of the tomb, one of the silent sentinels who stood watch day and night, honoring the unknown and the fallen. To see him here, in motion instead of stillness, walking among the grieving, was as unexpected as it was profound. The family at the front turned slightly when they heard the murmurs ripple through the crowd. The widow, her black veil trembling in the breeze, lifted her eyes. When she saw him, recognition dawned, followed quickly by tears that spilled harder, faster, as though some dam inside her had been breached. She clutched the arm of the man beside her and whispered something only he could hear. His lips pressed tight, his face crumpled for a moment. Then he nodded faintly. Still the guard said nothing. He did not break the rhythm of the procession, did not draw attention to himself beyond the act of walking, but his silence carried weight. Those watching from the sidewalks began to whisper his presence to one another. "He's one of them, the ones at the tomb." The word spread, not with gossip's sting, but with awe's hush. Children lifted onto their fathers' shoulders were told to watch closely. Old men removed their hats. Some of the veterans saluted, their hands trembling with the effort. And gradually what had begun as confusion turned into reverence. The crowd understood, even if they did not yet know the story. This was not intrusion, but devotion. The soldiers beside him felt it most sharply. Their boots had been heavy with grief already, their chests tight with the discipline required not to falter. But now, with the tomb guard among them, something shifted. His presence reminded them that they were not carrying this loss alone, that the sacred duty of remembrance stretched beyond their unit, beyond their ranks, into a brotherhood that transcended orders. Step after step they moved together. The sound of their boots echoed down the avenue, a heartbeat of loyalty and loss. The tomb guard's eyes never left the flag-draped casket at the front. His jaw was set, his face calm, but inside him memory stirred like a tide. He thought of the countless ceremonies he had witnessed in silence, standing in rain or sun as families wept. He thought of how many times he had wished to walk beside them, to shoulder their burden more directly, to tell them, without words, that their grief was seen. Today, finally, he allowed himself to step forward. As they neared the cemetery gates, the crowd lining the street began to join in the rhythm. Some tapped their feet in time with the boots. Others began humming softly the tune of a hymn that had not yet been sung. The air thickened with emotion, not chaotic but unified, a tide of sorrow carried together instead of alone. By the time the hearse slowed before the rows of headstones, the tomb guard's presence was no longer questioned. It had become the quiet center of the procession. The family no longer looked ahead with hollow eyes. They looked ahead with tears streaming. Yes, but with the sense that they were not walking alone. The soldiers at his side no longer bore the casket's shadow in isolation. They bore it with the steadying strength of a sentinel whose life was given to honoring the dead. When the gates opened and the casket was lifted from the hearse, the tomb guard moved to one side, allowing the assigned pallbearers to take their places. But he did not leave. He remained in step, walking just behind them as the coffin made its way down the gravel path, the crunch of stones beneath boots marking each step toward farewell. Whispers rustled through the trees, carried by the wind itself. Why did he join them? Who asked him to come? But no answer came yet. That part of the story remained hidden, waiting to reveal itself when the time was right. For now, there was only the sight of a tomb guard whose duty was usually to stand still, silent and alone, walking among the grieving, shoulder to shoulder with those left behind. And that sight alone was enough to break hearts open, enough to make even the most disciplined soldiers blink back tears they had long sworn not to show. The casket was carried slowly beneath the canopy of trees, their branches swaying in sympathy with the wind. The cemetery stretched out in solemn rows, white headstones standing like silent witnesses, each one a life, a story, a sacrifice. The crowd followed, hushed and reverent, the scrape of shoes on gravel the only sound besides the muted sobs of grieving family members. The tomb guard remained just behind the pallbearers, his steps measured, his gaze locked on the flag draped carefully over the coffin. He did not seek attention. He sought only presence, the kind of presence that assures the living that the dead are not abandoned to emptiness. The soldiers walking at his side glanced at him more often now. They had begun the march surprised by his appearance, but now they seemed steadied by it, as though his silence lent them an extra measure of strength. Though she had been told many words over the last week, condolences, platitudes, assurances that her husband was a hero, none of them had reached her the way this did. The silent, unasked-for step of a sentinel who had no reason to be there except loyalty. The widow, walking at the front, felt it most of all. She turned her head once, caught a glimpse of his face, and whispered her husband's name under her breath. For the first time since the news had come, she did not feel entirely alone. When they reached the gravesite, the pallbearers set the coffin gently onto the platform above the open earth. The chaplain stepped forward, Bible in hand, his voice trembling as he began the familiar words. "I am the resurrection and the life." The crowd bowed their heads. The widow clutched her children close, and still the tomb guard stood at the edge, rigid, silent, his eyes fixed on the casket. When the chaplain finished, the rifle squad raised their weapons. 3 volleys cracked the air, sharp and final, echoing across the fields. A bugler lifted his horn and began to play taps, the mournful notes curling upward like smoke. Every soldier in attendance saluted. Civilians pressed hands over their hearts. The widow bowed her head, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. It was then, after the last note dissolved into silence, that the tomb guard moved. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped forward, drawing every eye. He stopped beside the casket, his hand trembling slightly as he placed a small object on the flag. The crowd leaned forward to see. It was a medal not his own, but one he had carried for years. A medal that belonged to a comrade long ago, entrusted to him before that comrade's final battle, never claimed by family. He had guarded it in silence, a private token of memory. And now, without a word, he laid it down as if passing it from one fallen soldier to another. The soldiers nearest him stiffened. Some blinked furiously, trying to force back tears. Others let them fall freely. They understood what had just happened, One life had been bound to another, one sacrifice recognized by one who knew its weight too well. The widow gasped softly when she saw the medal. She knew what it meant. Her husband had once told her stories of the comrades he'd trained with, men who had vanished into war and been spoken of only in half-remembered whispers. The tomb guard had not been a stranger to her husband after all. He had been a brother in arms, a witness to his courage in moments that would never make it into official records. Suddenly the pieces fit together. The guard had not joined the procession out of impulse or symbolism. He had joined because the man they were burying had once stood beside him, had once shared rations and laughter, had once shouldered the same impossible burdens. And now, in death, the guard would not let him walk alone. The widow broke down then, her sobs loud, unrestrained. She stepped forward, her children following, and placed her hand over the medal where it lay atop the casket. She whispered, "Thank you for walking with him again." The guard did not speak. He only bowed his head. One of the soldiers in the detail could no longer hold back. His tears spilled as he saluted. Another followed, and another. Soon the entire row of uniformed men stood with tears streaking their faces, their discipline undone not by weakness, but by the sheer force of loyalty and love revealed before them. The chaplain, his own voice thick with emotion, finally broke the silence. "This," he said, gesturing toward the tomb guard, "is what it means to remember. Not only in words, not only in monuments, but in presence, in the act of walking beside grief when it feels unbearable." The crowd murmured agreement. Some wept openly, others bowed their heads, and still others whispered prayers that were more gratitude than plea. The guard stepped back then, his duty complete. He returned to the edge of the crowd, resuming the stillness that had defined his life. But everyone who had seen him knew that something extraordinary had passed between the living and the dead, between comrades separated by time but reunited in loyalty. The ceremony concluded, the flag was folded and presented to the widow. Her hands trembled as she accepted it, but she held it close with a new steadiness, as though the weight had been lightened by the knowledge that her husband had not walked his final steps alone. As people began to drift away, the soldiers lingered. Many approached the tomb guard quietly, saluting him, shaking his hand, thanking him with words choked by emotion. He accepted their gestures with humility, offering only nods, never speeches. One young soldier, barely out of his teens, said softly, "I hope someone walks with me like that someday." The guard met his eyes and answered simply, "They will." Those who witnessed it would tell others, of the guard who stepped out of the crowd and joined the funeral, of the medal laid upon the casket, of the tears that fell from soldiers who had thought themselves too disciplined to weep. It would ripple outward, carried from town to town, until it became a reminder wherever it was told, that true honor is not in uniforms or ceremonies alone, but in showing up when the world least expects it, in carrying a brother's memory not just in silence but in presence. We never leave each other behind. By the time the cemetery emptied, the story had already begun to spread. That night, as the tomb guard resumed his watch in front of the eternal flame, he felt no conflict between the stillness of his post and the steps he had taken earlier that day. Both were part of the same vow, that no soldier walks alone into death, that no sacrifice slips into oblivion, that remembrance is as alive as breath. And though the world might move on, though tomorrow's news might find other headlines, those who had stood in that cemetery would never forget. They had seen what loyalty looks like when it takes shape in flesh and bone, what love looks like when it transcends death. And the memory of that sight, the guard, joining a funeral procession, silent but unyielding, would bring tears to soldiers for years to come.